We are here today on CEO Insights talking with Steve Lanzano, who is the CEO of TVB, which is the trade association that represents the local TV stations from throughout the United States. And Steve is going to talk to us today about this growing interrelationship between the media and the gaming world through the proliferation of sports betting, and perhaps what it means financially for that industry. And so, Steve, welcome.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks for having me today.
Steve, one thing that we all know is true is that the world has changed dramatically in the 3 short years since the United States Supreme Court paved the way for legalized sports betting. And it has especially affected your industry, the media industry, the television industry. Tell us a little bit about what that impact has been and how big a phenomenon and a meaningful phenomenon you see this becoming.
Sure, Frank. I mean, it's been very interesting because, the expectation was when the Supreme Court allowed legalizing sports betting, things were going to really ramp up fairly quickly. Now, of course, it took times for state legislature, since it's regulated by the states, to pass the bills and then begin the betting. So our expectation was really 2019 going into 2020, when things would really start to ramp up in terms of advertising around sports betting. But obviously the pandemic changed everything. So what we've really seen is a huge ramp up starting in third quarter of this year, which obviously follows the college football and the NFL season. So a huge ramp up in third quarter, a bigger ramp up in fourth quarter, and that continuing in first quarter of this year, especially since we had March Madness this year versus prior years. But to give you a little inside baseball on this, I mean, this is a category that essentially exploded. And now for many of the stations, it's a top 5 category in terms of advertising revenue, not including their retransmission revenue, just straight advertising revenue. In some cases, it's become a number 2 category. In some cases, it's almost 10% of their revenue. And it's really helped in terms of core advertising, separating out, sans political advertising, because obviously took a little bit of a hit on automotive, et cetera. So it really helped replace some of the automotive advertising that we lost because of the pandemic. And even now, automotive advertising is starting to come back, but because of the issues with supply in terms of semiconductors, in terms of rubber, in terms of other things, there's not a lot of supply in the marketplace in terms of inventory. So the ramp up in terms of auto has slowed up, but certainly the advertising has sped up in terms of sports betting. And I make an analogy, Frank, that sports betting is almost analogous to what's political advertising. Because, right, political is state by state, right? You have your gubernatorial and senatorial and congressional elections. So this is a state by state competitive fight with the sport betting resources that are out there, casinos, online, et cetera. So the advertising is on a state basis, it's local. And what we're seeing is the growth is quite frankly being astronomical and should continue. And a lot of that's going to really depend upon how quickly more states start putting in and passing legislation to have sports betting. Now, the size of the marketplace has really exploded when you look at the size of the betting marketplace. I know Flutter had come out with a number that by 2024, they thought their revenue would be like $8 billion. But now they said it'll probably exceed $20 billion. So they've already tripled for the next couple of years what numbers that they expect. And in fact, in the first 2 months of this year, there were $7.8 billion wagered. Okay, to give some perspective, versus 2020, that number is double the $4 billion that was wages. And of course, revenue increase. And what we're seeing is obviously as more people bet, that kind of same direct relationship in terms of percentage increases is the percentage increases we're seeing in terms of advertising. And we're seeing a lot of advertising. Everybody knows about DraftKings and FanDuel, but there are so many smaller advertisers out there who have to create awareness that they provide the resource and the opportunity to bet. And so we're seeing a lot of numbers and a lot of dollars from them. We're also seeing more long form advertising, not just 30-second spots, but 2-minute spots, especially for casinos. We're also seeing some like FanDuel and DraftKings who are doing half-hour spots to educate the consumer in terms of, basically long form programming in terms of how to bet online. So we see this continuing to explode. Super Bowl betting this year was up 70%. And, I look to the UK for a lot of where I think this is going, simply because it's a much more mature market in terms of sports betting. And, we haven't seen the in-game sports betting yet, which I think is going to become an opportunity. Only 10% of the betting that's done in the US is in-game. Over 75% in the UK is in-game. So there's opportunities there. But really the growth of this category for the broadcasters will depend upon the increase in the number of states that pass legislation. Right now, there are 20 states, including the District of Columbia, that allow online and sports betting. My expectation is there was a thought that there might be 15 or 16 states this year that would pass legislation. I think it's going to be more like 9 or 10, Frank, that are going to be passing legislation. So that'll bring us up to 30 states. There are 17 states that have bills in front of their state legislatures. Not sure they're going to pass this year, but certainly should pass within the next 12 to 18 months. And then there are 3 states, Wisconsin, Idaho, and Utah. I'm not sure Utah ever is going to have online gambling in the near future, but Wisconsin and Idaho. Wisconsin was the one that kind of, wow, Wisconsin. But Wisconsin and Idaho still don't even have a bill that's even been presented yet. So the growth of this category will continue as obviously now sports are back. And the growth of this category will continue because more states will open up in terms of online sports betting. So it's kind of, to me, as I said, analogous to political, except it's not every other year, it's every year. And it's a year long, it's really, football, basketball, but people bet on baseball, they bet on tennis, they bet on golf, not to the same degree, obviously. So throughout the year, there are opportunities where people will bet. And of course, as these states open up, and in some of them, they're going to have 20 licenses to 100 licenses. So, they're going to have to get their names out there. And that's why I think Spot TV has been one of the big beneficiaries of sports betting advertising.
Yeah, I kind of look at it as a double benefit. One is that there's greater interest in a contest when people have money on it. So it should help drive ratings.
I wasn't, Frank. I'm not a big bettor. My kids are. And so I did my first parlay last football season. And I said, big Giant fan, Giants are going to win, the Eagles are going to win, and we're going to go to the playoffs. And of course, when the Eagles pulled their quarterback and we didn't do that, I said, that's it. I'm not betting anymore. Of course, the next week I bet. But anyway.
So it drives up ratings, which gives you more pricing power for advertising. And also, it's an entirely new category of advertising.
Correct.
So when the world normalizes from COVID, you'll have your old business back, plus a new category on top of that.
Yeah, it's almost over the past 5 years, another category, the legal category, has exploded to become a number 3 category. Came out of nowhere. I expect that sports betting is going to be on that same meteoric rise as we've seen in legal.
One thing that we see as a result of the legalization of sports betting is a lot of alliances, a lot of TV groups and individual stations in local markets have signed alliances now, marketing agreements and so on, with sports betting companies and in combination with the resident sports leagues and teams. Which of these do you think are most meaningful, and how do you see this developing as time goes on?
That's a great question, Frank. I think you're going to see more sports betting sponsorships with the stations in terms of not only sports programming, but other programming and including news programming. News is not one you would say is something that young people watch, right? Because sports betting is really a younger male demographic. But because of the pandemic, young adults, actually 18 and 24-year-olds, have increased their viewership of news by 100% versus 2019. And that number's actually increased to 45% since 2019. So I think there's opportunities that we're looking at now, especially during the sports segment, where they can do sponsorships, do alliances saying, hey, the Yankees are playing tonight or the Mets are playing tonight. And therefore, do a sponsorship, says, go to X, Y, and Z. And if you want, and put a wager down on it. So I think you're going to see more of that. I also think, and this is much further down the road, Frank, with the next gen ATSC 3.0 broadcast standard, where it provides addressability but interactivity, so that it could drive somebody. You could go directly from watching your TV and go directly to someone's betting site. Now that's way further down the road. That's a few years down the road. The expectation is we won't have ATSC 3.0 will get to some level of scale by the end of the year, probably about 70% of the US. But of course, people need to have the chip in their phone or have the TV set to be able to get that signal. But there's an application and a monetization of ATSC 3.0 that we could see dollars from down the road and in the future.
You used the analogy, Steve, earlier of political campaigns. And I understand there's another analogy that you use, which is to liken sports betting today to the early days of daily fantasy sports. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, Frank, when FanDuel and DraftKings came out, I'm not a big, with these fantasy things, but they was just exploded a few years ago. And they were spending hundreds of millions of dollars to get people to sign up, create awareness for both DraftKings and FanDuel and doing fantasy football. In fact, they became basically the #2 advertiser in NFL football. And that's what we're seeing now in the same analogy in terms of what's happening is as these states open up, all of these resources to do online betting have to get that awareness out. So they're spending a ton of money to get people right. It's always, first impressions are lasting ones. The first place you go to was the one you keep. It's like credit cards. Everybody has their first credit card and they use it more often than others. The same thing. They want to make sure you're going to go to their site and use their service when you bet online and do sports betting. So we're seeing really a ton of money coming in initially now. And I expect as each individual state opens up, that's going to continue, Frank, in terms of a real explosion early. And then I think you'll see some, obviously like anything else, there'll be some moderation in terms of the advertising, but moderating on a fairly high level and moderating in a category where we didn't have any money even, 3 or 4 years ago.
You made reference earlier, Steve, to the UK. The UK, the regulators, a lot of political people in the UK have sort of scaled back some of the, not scaled back, but maybe made more restrictive would be the better way to phrase it, rules on gambling advertising, including on TV. For example, no prime time bet advertising because kids, underage people would be watching TV
Right.
at the time. What kind of policies or codes of conduct does the American TV industry have in regard to responsible gaming?
I think you're going to see within the advertising, Frank, where they're going to have a bunch of disclaimers, right, regarding warnings about betting and wagering, and obviously, bettors anonymous. So I think you're going to see a lot of that in the creative of the advertising. There are currently, regulations in terms of what program you can advertise in. It's very different on Fox football broadcasts, what you can do versus CBS football broadcast you can do. So I think it's going to be fairly open when we start out, and as this ramps up, but obviously there'll be some regulations to ensure that, because, nobody wants someone who has a gambling issue. It's not good for anybody. It's not good for that person. It's not good for the industry as a whole. And nobody wants that. Everybody wants to make sure that we protect against that. So I think it's going to be fairly open to begin with, but you're going to start seeing these regulations happening more and more. I mean, most of the states, the 20 states, I'm going to say there's only like 5 that are 18 plus. Most of them are 21 plus, which I think is a good thing. And maybe they'll look at programming that skews more 21 plus than 18 plus. But I don't see that happening initially. But we'll have to keep an eye on what regulations happening, 2, 3, 4 years down the road. And again, I think you're right, Frank. Looking at what's happening in the UK will be a good guide.
Steve, in your role, you talk to a lot of investors as well as stakeholders and other stakeholders in the TV industry. What kinds of things should investors look at as they're trying to assess the impact of this fast changing world of sports betting and television?
Yeah, I think the number one thing, Frank, now to look at is it's really now it's really percolated up, and now it's a real thing, and we're seeing significant advertising in front of it. I think investors need to continue to look at what states are opening up, what are the DMAs in that state, what station groups have stations in that state, because that'll really affect the advertising that they're going to get. So as we move into these next 10 states, how quickly they ramp up, and how quickly you see multiple options and 20, 30, 40 licensees. I think everyone's interested in what's going to happen in California, Florida, and Texas. Those are the big states. Florida and Texas also have casinos. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what that means in terms of sports betting. Florida and Texas also, don't have state taxes. So again, I think they'll be more likely to open up and let things thrive. So I think it'd be very interesting to see what happens in those 3 states. The one state that we're seeing, it looks like it's going to be more regulated, is going to be New York, where they're going to have an RFP process. They're going to limit the amount of licensees, so it may not be as robust as other states. But really, when you look at it, it's really to keep your eye on and stay up to date in terms of what states are passing, are legalizing and passing sports betting. How many licensees are they allowing? And then how quickly that'll ramp up. Because once that happens is when the money's going to start flowing into the stations.
Okay. Well, Steve, we've covered a lot of territory in a short time. What else would you like folks to know?
This is as you said, Frank, this is a brand new category. It's new money. It's significant money. And I think there's going to be things that are going to be done in this category, like sponsorships and long form programming that you normally don't see in other categories. So I think, it'll continue to grow, and then, keep an eye on, obviously, regulations 2 or 3 years down the road and see how that affects the category.
Okay, well, Steve, thank you for your insights.
My pleasure, Frank. Again, thanks for having me today.